Welcome, everyone. We're here again with another lesson in Conchas y Café. Today, I will be the one to take the lead in this particular lesson, but of course, at any time, feel free to jump on in, drop your questions in the chat, raise your hand, do all the good stuff to help make this interactive. And for those of you that might have already downloaded the handout on Google Classroom, we're going to go ahead and just dive right into the very first quote of the day. Here, today's quote, we are reviewing something by Rumi. Rumi is a very well-known poet, Persian poet from the 13th century. He is quoted as saying, "Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation." Y para los hispanohablantes, aquí se los traducí. Rumi, aquí tenemos la cita de Rumi que dice, "El silencio es el lenguaje de Dios. Todo lo demás es una mala traducción." So we're going to go ahead and drop this here in our chat for everyone to reference. But what does this make you think as you read these quotes, or this single quote translated? ¿Cómo les parece lo que dice Rumi aquí? Abraham?
This is really cool. I think he does a lot of spiritual stuff, right?
Yeah.
The writer? Yeah. Definitely reminds me of because I do a lot of photography, especially in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this concept of us translating what we see. And sometimes even people say like, oh, a photograph doesn't do justice,
Mm-hmm.
because it's how it's lost in translation in whoever is picking up that. Sometimes it's a good way because somebody is able to put it in a better context, but it's definitely that how do we perceive nature and life, right? And how do we translate that into writing, photography, illustrations, music, etc.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Miss Lois?
Abraham cheat because he knows more about him than we do. At least I do. Taking one line at a time, biblically speaking, the little g means a little God, not the mighty God. And so that would refer to us. And so that first line where it says silence is the language of God, I think that's what it said. I don't Okay. And so that would be us, whether we speak up or not. It doesn't mean a hill of beans to those who don't want to receive it as anything, but some people say silence is golden, but just being, how do you say, say for instance, like us in our writing, and we want people to accept it, to enhance it, and maybe be able to use it, and maybe to help them in some way, shape, or form. Whether we do it or not, it's not going to make a difference or a great big impact, to the whole nation or even our community as a whole. That's what I got out of that first line. Let me hear something from someone else that'll help me to understand a little bit better.
Okay. Well, in all fairness, I mean, Abraham, although he does know a little bit about Rumi, I didn't go into like the full little bio, but for those that are interested, Rumi, as I put in the little bio, is a 13th century Persian poet. He's a Hanafi faqih, basically meaning that he is a scholar of the Hanafi teachings. Hanafi being, another Islamic scholar, and a Maturidi theologian. So basically, his work and his basically all of his poetry was really grounded in theology, the theology of Islam, and also the Sufi practice. So very much grounded in spirituality. That was like the core of his work. So that maybe might, help clarify a little bit. Miss Luce and then Dr. Rosie. I saw your hand first, Miss Luce.
Hello, everyone. Good evening.
Hi.
Rumi is a man after my own heart. I'm sure I mentioned it before, but I I've done some meditation retreats, silent retreats, 10 days and 20 days, delving into silence. And I discovered, I think, maybe a tiny bit what Rumi is referring to. I feel like there is a wordless understanding. There's a way of capturing, I guess, the forces of creativity or a knowledge that doesn't require words at all. It's something that keeps me going back to these retreats, and I think makes me yearn for a 45-day or a 60-day retreat. I think there's still so much more there in the silence, which is worth seeking out.
Yeah, I love the perspective that Miss Luz brings to this specifically because of your practice in trying to find inner balance. Like I want to say, through silence. I think that is a really great sort of unique perspective that you're able to share with us, and I also appreciate very much that you have that insight into what Rumi might be speaking to, right? Um, Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation. Um, that's a very unique phrasing for sure. Um, but yeah, thank you, Miss Luz. Thank you for sharing your insights.
You're welcome. I wish I had really the words to express it.
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the things that Rumi is getting at with this quote in particular. Everything else you can't match that silence. Yeah. So I guess that speaks to the quote.
It certainly does.
Dr. Rosie, you also had your hand up.
Yes. I love what you said, Luz. That I think that's awesome. When you have opportunities to do meditation, I think it's great. I should be doing more of it, but así es la vida. But let me just say that when just reading this quote, there's a lot of people that are so uncomfortable with silence. Just the space and with silence, and they're sometimes even uncomfortable with themselves. Of being in just not doing anything, just being silent. So it is definitely the that silence is the language of God, of yourself. So you got to start with yourself, that inner self, that peace, that inner peace within yourself, because anything else, whether you speak it or someone speaks it or tries to interpret what you're doing, it is a poor translation. And so to me, I felt that this is a really good quote that, especially now with so much tension and stress and all that, I think we need to just have some silence and just centering ourselves and getting in touch with Mother Earth first within ourselves.
I think that's a really interesting observation to also have, is that this starts with yourself, and it kind of made me think of this other question that I want to make sure that I phrase in a correct way, but ultimately, silence can be difficult. It can be difficult to live within. It is a space, I think, as Dr. Rosie put it. There's it's not just a matter of not speaking and being silent yourself, but it's also allowing your environment to be still, to be silent. And speaking for myself, I know that I can go a whole day without talking. I don't have a problem with that. But I also know that I don't like to just sit in silence. I like to have music. Music basically plays in my head all day long. And if it's not in my head, obviously I'm playing it like, off my laptop, off my phone, I'm listening to headphones. So for me, I fill that space, that silent space, with music. It makes me happy. That's why I do it. But I think, I can recognize that just plain silence can be difficult for me. But the question that I wanted to pose to everyone, being that Rumi is stating, silence is the language of God, all else is a poor translation. What does that mean in relation to voice, right? For you as a poet, for you as a writer, as an artist, is your voice the same as silence is for God? I mean, that's kind of like a theoretical question for sure, but Abraham?
It goes again with the how do we interpret the world, right? Like, let's see, I see an apple, right? And I'm the one who saw the apple. And then I go to some other friend or some group of people and I'm describing this amazing apple, right? Like, that's my duty to translate whatever was there with my voice, right? So it's kind of a process of communicating, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that kind of came into my mind was a few weeks ago when we were talking about the Ars Poetica, and Vicente Huidobro wrote in his poem that the poet is a little god, el poeta es un pequeño Dios, and if that is the case, then what does it mean to be silent as a god, right? Like interesting paradoxes. But anyway, Jessica.
That's what I was wondering too, like, because so much, well, not know about so much, but recently we've been talking about how, like, as poets, how we have the opportunity to provide like perspective by using our voice. And then earlier we learned, to, what was it that we said? I think it was just something like, if you don't speak about it, then you can't preach about, or something like, well, that was not the words we used, but that was like my interpretation of it. Like, if you're not speaking on a subject, like we have the ability to like change so many things through our voice, through our writing. So are we talking about, I guess that is back to your original question, like actually speaking, or is this also speaking, or do you think he's referring to even what we write, like our words, our thoughts? That's my first question that I'm wondering. But then you just said something that also made me think. I don't remember, but if I do, I'll raise my hand.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say. I guess it's an interesting paradox to consider. If we are like little gods as writers, as poets, and the language of God is silence, then what does that mean for us as writers? Jess?
Oh, now I know what I was gonna say when you said that. So I think maybe he might be referring to, or I guess how I'm interpreting it now is that I think he's referring to judgment, like a voice of judgment is like a God would be righteous to be silent and accept. Even if someone said, like, this is my thing, it's like, even if I said I'm anti-abortion, you would have people hypocritically saying, how could you think that way? Like, I think God like just doesn't judge flat out, whatever the reason is. Like, there is no right, there is no wrong, or there's a respect for that. So it's just interesting. So maybe I guess I'm gonna take it more as he's saying silence when it comes to judging someone that doesn't agree with you is being godlike. Like, I know a lot of people that do things that it's not even about me agreeing, but have a different opinion on, and I don't judge them at all.
Yeah, I just kind of rephrased my question for the chat there since Miss Luce was asking me to rephrase it or pose it in the chat. But yeah, it's an interesting paradox for sure. It's hopefully getting people to think a little bit about what their purpose is as writers. Roots, and then Dr. Rosie. Go ahead, Roots.
Yeah, and what this made me think about was I don't know exactly where the quote is from, but it says, prayer is when you talk to God, and meditation is when you listen. So that's kind of like what it came to mind. Like, and I feel that that goes back to also like us being so uncomfortable with silence because it's like a connection to source inside of yourself. And we don't want to self-criticize. Like, we don't want to like admit to where we're going wrong or where we could do better a lot of times, you know. We'd rather distract ourselves and like entertain pleasures that are like something that's just going to soothe the moment kind of thing. And I feel like what I got from this was like when you're silent, that's when, you know, you speak, you connect with creator, and that's where your voice comes in. So if you're not silent, it's pretty much you're just regurgitating all these distractions that you're listening to all day, the radio, the TV, you know, but you never really stop and like have a thought that's your thought. So yeah.
That is a great insight for sure. I think there is something to that. Think about like technology and how far technology has come. We now have the ability, especially for people with a smartphone, to basically limit how much time you spend on the phone, right? Because it's been found that there are way too many people spending way too much time on social media, ultimately. That was the purpose for creating that specific feature. And, if that is a problem for someone, spending so much time on social media without thinking critically, of course, at what point do you just simply start regurgitating the things that you take in? Is it your voice at that point, or are you just simply becoming part of a larger voice that is not unique, not in tune, maybe not authentic anymore? So,
Exactly. So
yeah.
that's when I think that the silence is necessary as a poet.
Mhm.
And then once we get the message as a poet, it's also our duty to bring it out into the world.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that. Definitely. Dr. Rosie?
Uh, yeah, I'm also looking at it like when we're starting to write, or when I'm starting to learn to write poetry, um and since I get excited about it, and I tend to be, when I read the poem, I'm excited and I have certain emotions to it. It kind of feels like when I stop somewhere, or when I make the that poetry part silent, I'm heightening some type of an emotion from that. It means something.
Hmm.
I'm magnifying it, or it could bring some kind of suspense to it. It could bring some kind of drama to it, like where the reader is like, well, ¿qué va a ser? What's going to happen? And so that's what what I see it as, like when we put some kind of silence notation, so, to show silence a certain part. I feel that we're trying to get the reader to engage with us with what we're feeling. And so that'll help whatever character, whatever word, the intention that I learned last week from Abraham, our intention to grow and develop, and then whatever we're going to make it at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to maybe understand how silence can be incorporated into our voice, right? Because if your intention is to give your audience a moment for connection, and if we're all generally thinking of silence as a sort of spiritual connection, a moment to listen, silence then, if that is the case, has a very profound impact on your writing, on your poetry, especially if you're deliberately adding silent spaces, on the page. It'd be, extra line breaks, or, other little techniques that you can use, like a caesura, to, break up a rhythm. So for sure, I think all of us are sort of beginning to work our minds, and really thinking about, what it is to have a voice, and maybe even know when that voice is needed and when it's not, right? When silence is the voice. So excellent stuff. And I think this is a good moment for us to maybe look at something that contrasts with that concept. So we're going to start off with a second piece, I want to call it, of writing. Let's see if my screen will. There we go. So this is a very short little piece. Este viene de El Libro de los Abrazos, para ustedes que lo conocen. This is, I think, a great book, especially for anyone that is sort of experimenting with prose and poetry together. This is a really strong piece of work by Eduardo Galeano. We have looked at Eduardo Galeano's work before, but for those who don't know who he is, he was born on the 3rd of September in 1940, and he passed away the 13th of April in 2015. He was an Uruguayan journalist, writer, and novelist, considered, among many things, the preeminent man of letters about soccer, and a literary giant of leftist Latin America. Aquí en español traducido, como dice, nació el 3 de septiembre en el año 1940 y falleció el 13 de abril en el año 2015. Fue periodista, escritor y novelista uruguayo, considerado, entre varias cosas, el preeminente hombre de letras del fútbol global y un gigante literario de Latinoamérica izquierdista. The fact that he was leftist, is, I think, very informative, knowing that he was communist in his ideologies will certainly help you understand why his voice is what it is. However, that said, because of the history of Latin America and because of his journalistic background, that definitely will be, I want to say, an even stronger influence on his voice in particular, which I want us to really pay attention to as we read this particular entry from the Book of Embraces. It's called Celebration of the Human Voice, number 1. Si tengo aquí alguien quien gusta leerlo. It's a very short little piece, as you can see. We'll start off with the English, or Miss Luz, if you prefer the Spanish.
Yes, I'd really like to read the Spanish if nobody else wants to.
Vale, go for it. Whenever you're ready.
Los indios Shaur, los llamados jíbaros, cortan la cabeza del vencido. La cortan y la reducen hasta que cabe en un puño para que el vencido no resucite. Pero el vencido no está del todo vencido hasta que le cierran la boca. Por eso le cosen los labios con una fibra que jamás se pudre.
Excellent.
Ooh-wee. Pretty drastic.
Pretty drastic, yeah. And for our English speakers, do I have a volunteer?
I'll do it.
All right, Dr. Rosie, whenever you're ready.
Sure tribe, those called Jivaros, cut off the heads of the vanquished. They decapitated it and shrunk it until it fits in the palm of a hand, so that the vanquished do not resuscitate. But the vanquished is not completely defeated until their mouth is sealed. That is why their lips are stitched closed with a fiber that will never rot.
So, in the meantime, though, Elena, did you follow along with what we're just reading? Did you understand it?
Yes.
What are your thoughts about it?
My thoughts of that celebration is like Halloween, winter, Hanukkah, and Christmas, and Passover, and Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and other Jewish stuff is like a celebration to me.
Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like you were thinking celebration in other ways. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Any other thoughts about these this particular little piece, celebration of the human voice, aside from Mortal Kombat, according to Abraham?
All I
Roots?
can see is it's a demonstration of what the previous statement was all about. And I used to see these little heads in voodoo movies and jungle movies.
Yeah.
And I don't know what they were called, those little bitty heads with the sewed up mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't even think it was real. I thought it was just part of the drama of the movie. Yeah, so I don't know. Somebody else talk about it. Let me get some more information, like I did before. I'm enjoying this.
Okay. Roots?
I feel like this is kind of like them, how they like are stating, I guess, their victory and how like they stand up for themselves and like kind of like the things that can happen to you if you're I don't know, kind of like I felt it like kind of like a threat, kind of like their voice is like, we're gonna, this is what we're gonna do if you come cross this kind of thing. That's how I felt it.
Interesting. Okay, so you were looking at it as a way in which the victor essentially asserts a dominance. Is that kind of what I'm getting from you? Is that correct?
Kind of like, yeah, like with their action, that's how they're speaking to other people. Like, kind of like they're protecting their space. They're gonna, they'll be savage about what they have to do to you, but
Okay.
Yeah, that's like their voice, their action.
Okay.
Like kind of like actions speak louder than words kind of thing. Like
Mhm.
I just got this like really like gruesome mental picture with like what it's saying, and I can imagine like, like the old movies where they put like the head on the spears, and they used to do that to like scare off the people who would come back to their space or whatever.
Mhm.
That's the mental picture I got.
Okay.
Gracias.
Cool. All right. I think it was Miss Michelle and then Dr. Rosie. So, Miss Michelle?
I was thinking about the same quote, actions speak louder than words, but also about Theodore Roosevelt, speak softly, but carry a big stick, because this prose to me tells you if you don't represent yourself, who's going to speak for yourself, and yet your mouth is quiet. And I was thinking about what I put in the chat earlier, that silence is golden. And apparently, I thought, that's what it seems to be to me regarding this celebration of the human voice. You don't have to. You can speak for yourself. At the same time, you need to speak without being intimidated, or else you get in trouble. And yet, at the same time, this quote occurred to me for those reasons, based on what I read here in this prose piece. But I'm not familiar with Uruguay. I know it's in South America. And I was going to ask you, could this have been written because of war or something that happened in the country to have him influence to write the piece? Maybe?
Well, the history of Latin America is one where you could think of South America, specifically the countries of Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, as having a history that is similar to the United States, in that you had obviously Spanish rule, but then after independence, most of those countries had a large influx of Western Europeans that had more of a settler and mentality, and ended up pushing out the Native American groups from South America, ultimately decimating them in a very similar way through smallpox, other diseases, racism, lynchings, that kind of thing. But this piece, I'm not 100% sure whether that particular history is necessarily reflected in it. But
Okay.
I'm sure that's something that would be up for debate among different people that have studied it further. Let's see. So next, I think we had Dr. Rosie, and then Jessica, and then Miss Luz, and we'll finish off with Abraham. So, Dr. Rosie?
I find that quite interesting because it's talking about a celebration of human voice, yet we're sealing the lips of these dead individuals with a fiber that can never rot. So it seems so opposite. But at one time, these voices spoke. They had something to say, and so the jibaros either didn't like it or showed to be more controlling or stronger by decapitating them and shutting their voices, and then shrinking them, their heads. So the celebration was, and then I also found it interesting that it didn't say anything in there about they would do a certain ritual dance or a ritual anything. It was just the action of doing that. So I wonder who was stronger in terms of the voices that needed to speak. Was it those that were vanquished, that probably had something to say, and the jibaros didn't like it, so that was their way of shutting them up. So it's kind of conflicting, but those are my thoughts.
No, but very good observations for sure, and I want to see where this train of thought goes.
Okay.
So I think I said Jessica was next, and then Miss Luz. So Jess.
So actually, I think the title goes really well with the words. I think there's a lot of symbolism being used. Words that came to me were like humiliation, the fact that you didn't leave the head the size of the body to humiliate how small you've been turned into. Like you were this, and the vanquished, obviously, this is like an enemy, right? So not just an enemy, but a conquered enemy. So we beat you, right? And they were enemies. The people that fight are enemies amongst each other. So it's two enemies, and the winner has decapitated this person, then humiliated this person by shrinking their head. And not only did they that, but they've silenced them forever. The symbolism of using a material that will never rot, meaning for eternity you will be silenced, and we have you. And I thought what was really interesting, so celebration of without using a voice, right? We're reading this. There's a celebration there that they won, that they conquered, that they humiliated. These, not only do we humiliated them and we've silenced them. And I think what I thought what was really interesting and cool is how I looked at it like we have you in the palm of our hands, literally. Because your voice is in the palm of our hands. We can't do anything with your body, but if you could speak, you could tell your story, you could tell your lineage, you could tell these great things about your tribe. But we have you,
Yeah. So
it's a celebration of the Shuar tribe's voice.
Yeah, in a way, for sure. Yeah. The phrase that comes to mind is history is told by the winners. Right.
Yeah, because they're the one in this particular instance. Yeah. They are the vanquished. Have been. Yeah. These enemies have clearly been beaten.
Yeah. Thank you for those insights, Jess. Miss Luz.
I really enjoyed this because it expresses the power of voice, or the spoken word, that you can feel the energy, the vibration of the voice that they're trying to silence. How I think it took me to the cause and effect, or the repercussions of the word, of the spoken word. We forget that our words are important, how we express them, the energy that they carry. So I feel that their need to go to these extremes to silence their enemy speaks to the strength of the voice and the respect they have for the power of the voice. And I think also maybe even a warning to others who may want to repeat what their enemy was speaking. Don't forget, this is what we do to you if you say what our enemy says.
So kind of piggybacking, I think, off of that idea of humiliation, right, Ms. Luz?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Very, very good insights for sure. I think if I were to try and analyze this, I would probably go along that same route. Abraham, you had some comments you wanted to share as well.
Well, I think this is a really colonializing kind of interpretation of things as well. I don't see the voice of the indigenous people speaking here. It's somebody interpreting for their own purpose, kind of repurposing a ritual, which is basically they also shut their eyes and their mouth so the things doesn't rot, because that's what you want. You want to preserve that head as much as you can. And also, always find fascinating how other cultures think something is so brutal when they were crucifying Christ. Like they see this as a harsh thing, and then they're crucifying people on the other side. So who's more brutal than the other person is how we interpret things. Like these savages here, we are more culture, and we have a Christ hanging on their necks. But anyway, so I find also fascinating that somebody spoke shit about somebody else's. They kill him, but still they feel like it hurts still. And so they have to shut their mouth still so they can live with the peace of mind.
That's one way of looking at it for sure. But imagine, that is maybe one of the reasons why it was necessary to sew the mouth shut, right? For the peace of mind, because there is a power in the voice, even if it is the voice of a dead man. It's a very, very interesting way of looking at this for sure. So, let's go back to the handout here real quick and let's read this one more time and let's sort of process it in the ways in which you're all kind of independently thinking about it. And I'll read it in Spanish again to start. Los indios Shuar, los llamados jíbaros, cortan la cabeza del vencido, la cortan y la reducen hasta que cabe en un puño para que el vencido no resucite. Pero el vencido no está del todo vencido hasta que le cierran la boca. Por eso le cosen los labios con una fibra que jamás se pudre. And in English, the Shuar tribe, those called Jíbaros, cut off the head of their vanquished. They decapitate it and shrink it until it fits in the palm of a hand, so that the vanquished do not resuscitate. But the vanquished is not completely defeated until their mouth is sealed. That is why their lips are stitched closed with a fiber that will never rot. For me, when I read that, I really do think about, the title. It's the celebration of the human voice. And I think for me, what Eduardo Galeano is essentially trying to say is that even in death, unless if you are, forced to lose your voice, you can still have something to say. And you are not dead. You are not completely dead or defeated until that ability to share your voice is completely taken away from you. So if we think about this in the sense of, this is a celebration of the voice, of the human voice, everything that you write, everything that you leave behind, whether it's published or not, if it's written down, that is your voice, and it's living on in perpetuity as long as people are able to read it and connect with it. That right there is the power of the human voice. The human voice can live beyond death. It's the one thing that could potentially still resuscitate the vanquished, right? So if you think of it in that way, if silence is the language of God, everything else is a poor translation. Even if you are writing, in a way to describe silence, according to Rumi, that is still going to be better because it's going to live on forever. So if we're kind of trying to, connect the dots here, I want to just simply reinforce, all of you, the act of writing and your very deliberate method for writing, that is in itself an act of God, right? That is the act of a creator because you are mimicking the creator, whoever it is that you feel that might be. And in the act of writing, in the act of publishing, your voice will be eternal. Your voice will continue to resonate throughout time. And that is a very powerful thing to think about. When you really stop to contemplate that and consider what that means for you, for future generations, for even just, say your kids and grandkids, like your voice will live on and then they will live on with it because they will have it somewhere attached to them. So as we think about these things, I think it's really valuable for us to consider that impact and then to really begin to think about how it is that we're going to develop that, right? How do we develop that voice? It is something that we've been working on over the last few weeks. And I happened to come across this interesting I want to call it like a schematic, in a sense, a little list here of the things that make up a voice in terms of literary voice. I found this handout from another university here that basically broke down the elements of voice into 5 different things, which after I read it and kind of studied it a little bit, I was like, okay, yeah, I can get behind this. Some people might say there's 4 elements of voice. Some of these might, overlap in their own way. But, generally speaking, this is something that I think we can all sort of digest easily when we talk about voice and the areas in which we, as authors, as writers, as poets, really should regularly be trying to develop. So, the 5 elements of voice. Elena, you wanted to read for us. Would you like to read for me the one that says number 1?
Yes.
All right.
Number 1, addition into the author's words with unique vocabulary with a character/personal lexicon.
Excellent. Thank you, Elena. So essentially what diction is referring to is word choice. When it really comes down to it, if you want to just put it down into 2 words, it's word choice. But it's not word choice necessarily in the sense of like the words that you choose. It's also words that are necessary for really communicating. It could mean that there are unique vocabulary words. These are normally what you would call jargon. If you are writing for, say, work, and you're writing a technical paper or a technical email, you're going to have jargon or unique vocabulary words that are going to be part of that job. They're going to be part of your professional voice. But as authors, if you're going to be writing a short story or if you're going to be writing from the perspective of another person, your character or your persona that you're using is also going to have their own unique word choice, their lexicon. If we go back to the lesson that Abraham taught us about the alter ego is going to have a different lexicon than you, the author. They're going to speak differently because they are, in a sense, a different person. So that is what it means to discuss diction, to bring up diction. It is a deliberate use of word choice depending on the situation. And that is something that you can really expand on if you read a lot, honestly. As writers, you should be reading constantly, whether it's magazine articles, blogs, or books. You should definitely be reading because reading does improve your diction. Detail is the second one. Detail can be generally defined as facts, observations, or as the original handout that I found put it, the life and color of a scene, concept, or emotion. Basically, it's whatever it is that you decide as the author to elaborate on, whatever observations you feel are necessary for communicating your message. It could be color, it could be a texture, it could be an actual number, a fact, right? Something that is measurable. But it could also be an observation in the sense of like an emotional observation, the way in which a character responds to a particular situation. That can also be a detail. We also have imagery. And this right here, I think as poets, especially for speaking for myself, imagery is one of those things that I feel is going to always be the most important part of your voice as a poet. It is the verbal or written representation of a physical sense. Imagery is what helps ground us in real life. You can talk about love, you can talk about peace, you can talk about God, but we can't talk about those things and have people connect to them without using the 5 physical senses. We almost all of us have them. There might be some senses that are stronger than others. Some people may not have the ability to see. However, they might have, a stronger ability to smell and to feel. So these are going to be the ways in which we physically interact with the world, and our imagery, when we are writing, really, really needs to focus on that specific element of voice, because those are the things that are going to get people to really understand what you're saying in a real world way. I always like to use some of the biblical descriptions of heaven, or the promised land. The promised land, when you hear the phrase, the promised land, it doesn't say anything to you, right? It's not going to give you a picture. But if you say the land of milk and honey, you will immediately see in your mind milk and honey, because those are 2 physical objects. They are images that we can really connect with, whether it be from sight, smell, or taste, or even touch, because we know what the texture is of honey for most of us, or what the taste of milk is. Those things, the land of milk and honey, are ultimately images, metaphors, or symbols that help us represent a concept that is not a physical concept, the promised land. Syntax is the unique arrangement of words. And this can be within a line of verse, it can be within a sentence. Ultimately, it's the order in which you put your words together. It can refer to grammar, but it can also include things like the length of a line or a sentence. Think enjambment, right? If your enjambment is constructed in a particular way, or if your line break is constructed in a particular way, that is your unique syntax as an author. My syntax is going to be different from, say, Abraham's syntax. We each approach our writing in our own unique ways. And syntax is one of those things that makes up your unique voice. And then, of course, there's tone, the way in which you speak. It's going to demonstrate your attitude towards something. Tone will shift based on the emotional connection that you want to articulate. You're going to use a sadder tone if you're talking about sad things. You're going to use a stronger tone if you're talking about things that you're passionate about, things that you're angry about, things that you want people to, act on. You're going to have a different tone in the way in which you speak or present your writing. And tone ultimately encapsulates all of these things, right? The professional tone is going to have a particular kind of diction. It's going to focus on certain kinds of details, probably facts. And your imagery is going to be very direct. And of course, syntax, you're probably going to also want to be more direct, therefore have shorter sentences in a professional way. So these 5 elements right here are going to be, generally speaking, what make up your voice as an author, as a poet, as an artist, ultimately. Because some of these things, you can replace them even if you're a visual artist, with other ways of interpreting either diction or syntax. Does anyone have any questions so far? Do you agree with these 5 elements of voice?
I'm glad that you explained it. I'm just sitting back listening to the whole lesson. I mean, this is wonderful, and just like the one we had the week before, I forgot what you just stated it. The one that Abraham brought to us. I mean,
Alter ego.
yeah. I mean, it's just giving us so much information, and well, giving me anyway. I'm learning a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to encompass. I mean, this is great. We need more time, but to grasp it all,
Right.
But this is wonderful.
Well, imagine, these are the things that you could spend your entire life trying to develop, and they will change over time. Obviously, they are things that are constantly developing. We all have our own unique voice from when we're children. From the moment that we learn how to speak, we start to develop our own unique voice. That's actually, something that is sort of inherent to our personality. But of course, the more we learn, the more we read, the more we perform, the more you're going to have different approaches to diction, to, your syntax, to even tone. You're going to be able to learn different ways in which you can fluctuate, not just your physical voice when you're speaking, but your written voice. All of those things will develop over time based on the context in which you're writing, you're
Well,
creating.
the way you was explaining this remind me of the news, how they put emphasis on certain thing to make them seem more exciting or sad, or
Right.
playful, or cute, or, just
Mhm.
putting emphasis on words.
Yeah. And, if we go back and we look at the 2 pieces that we've already looked at today, I mean, you can compare them very easily and you can see these are 2 distinct writers, correct? I mean,
Yes.
Rumi, silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation. The tone is very different from the Shuar tribe, those called Jibaros, cut off the head of their vanquished. They decapitate it and shrink it until it fits in the palm of a hand, so that the vanquished do not resuscitate. But the vanquished is not completely defeated until their mouth is sealed. That is why their lips are stitched closed with a fiber that will never rot.
It's awful.
Completely different tone, correct?
Yes.
I mean, if you really listen to them and you really look at them, you'll notice, right? They're 2 very distinct voices. The one thing that they do have in common, though, is that there is a style to them, right? There is a deliberate style. Rumi, being a Sufi mystic, he was always writing things that were mystical, always writing things that were more focused on connecting with God, ultimately. Eduardo Galeano, being a journalist, he approached his writing as a journalist. He delivers facts. He delivers observations, comments that really get to the core of what he is trying to say. And ultimately, his message through this very short little, 4 or 5 sentence paragraph is that, no one is completely vanquished until their lips are stitched closed. That is why, this is a celebration of the human voice. So, they're both transmitting messages in a very succinct way, but they both are doing it using these 5 elements that we just talked about, right? So if we start to analyze writing, and we start to look for those 5 things, you're going to start noticing, especially if you do your own writing, you're going to start noticing that you do have a voice. Your voice exists in whatever it is that you're writing. It doesn't matter because, as we've already done in some of the previous practices with Abraham, if you go and ask people to tell you words that you use regularly, they'll be able to tell you right away if they know you well enough. Now, what do you think happens when a person physically no longer has their voice, does their written voice change?
No,
You don't think so? Why is that, Miss Lois?
I think it would.
because their mind isn't dead.
Right. Yeah. Jess, you wanted to add something?
Well, I think it would depend on. Maybe I'm thinking too technical about it, but it would depend on the circumstance on why they don't have a voice. Like if they went through some traumatic thing, I'm pretty sure there might be some negative messaging coming from them. Or versus if it's a vow of silence, like one of those things like that Luz goes on and doesn't talk for days at a time, like her writing. Well, her writing might be the same even if she did talk, but because she has a choice, she's choosing that. But I think if someone, I think it depends on the circumstance. I could just picture like if I got something like esophagus cancer, right, or something, and I was no longer able to speak, that I may go through because I tend to be funny in some of my writing. I may be a little bit more, I don't know what the right word is, but somber in my writing.
Yeah.
But
maybe.
only the details may change. Circumstances can change your details, but you're still, because when I went through, I hated to say it back then, I was in denial. My doctor told me be my own cheerleader if no one else cheered me on because that man I had. But there were times when I was like depressed. There were times that, I was going through something with the children, so they bring on a different concept of what's our theme? Decent living. No, but
The other one, yeah.
yeah. It brings on different types of writing. It might even help you to grow, to express yourself more. Write it out because my son always tell me, Mom, that might help someone else. Don't be ashamed. Write it down.
Yeah.
So it might open up even a new avenue.
Yeah, I think I was thinking more like literally.
Well, we'll come back to
can't-
this. We'll come back to
when you
this.
can't physically speak,
Yeah.
but your mind, if it's all there cognitively, I mean, it's still gonna do something.
Yeah, for sure. That I think is a fact. Miss Michelle, and then Roots, and we're going to move on because we're running short on time. Miss Michelle.
I was just going to say that in the book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, before her name was Maya Angelou, Marguerite Johnson was silent for months, or at least weeks, because regretfully she was molested by a family member, and that family member was dead the next day or the next few days, and she thought that she killed him. Rather than saying that it was killed by somebody else outside the home, but it was still like someone else, and more, I mean, although it wasn't proven that that's what it was, more likely it must have been somebody from the home. I mean, I don't know. The book didn't say that. But that, she chose to be quiet because she thought that she killed, by feeling that way, she felt as if I killed him, so I will be quiet. And her poetry and her writing was discovered at a very young age, I believe, in elementary school. And her teacher encouraged her to write. And we know Maya Angelou is, even if she passed away a while ago, she's still a prolific, iconic writer. And if you don't know, we all know who she is. Everybody on the call knows who she is. And she has a quarter in her name, a quarter. Sometimes sensitive, but nevertheless, I thought about that when you were talking in regards to the silence and how your voice can change. And it changed for her. And the last stretch of life. And she's a kind of writer and prolific.
I'm sorry, Miss Michelle, your audio is getting a little clipped there. It's hard to understand what you're saying, but
I'm saying that Dr. Maya Angelou, when she was younger, as an elementary student, she was molested by a relative.
Yeah.
And next day or the next 2 days, that They didn't do a family relative. Next day, either the day after or a few days after, that person was killed. So she thought that if she reported it, she thought it was her fault.
Mhm.
So she chose not to talk for a few days or weeks. I don't remember. But it's in a book called I Know What Occasion Received.
Mhm.
And that's what happened. That's what occurred to her. And that to me reflects trauma, it reflects hurt, it reflects her way of dealing with or accepting what happened, even though it was no fault of hers.
Mhm. Yeah.
The teacher encouraged her right to express herself, and she did. We know the writings of Dr. Maya Angelou today. She's a prolific, iconic writer.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Miss Michelle.
welcome.
Roots.
I just wanted to share something came to mind really quick that I was watching this like video and it was about these women that I think they were the moms of these children with autism and they were teaching them how to write and express themselves because people kind of think that because they can't really control their bodies, like they're not really cognitive, right? Like they're not really like thinking or connecting stuff like the way that we do, but they actually learn that they think just like we do, and they write that their bodies are actually not listening to the direction that their brain is giving their bodies. So I just thought like that's something important to like, you know, since we're speaking about the voice and how important it is to like express yourself. It's like releasing emotion, right?
Absolutely.
So that's all I wanted to say. I know we're pressed on time.
Well, no, but that's I think a great observation to share with the group because that's part of the reason why even DSTL Arts has Artistic Zine, which is a zine that is specifically dedicated to showcasing the voices of autistic individuals. Because autistics do have a voice, even if they may be unverbal, like they may not be able to speak verbally, their voice still exists because, as Miss Lois observed earlier, their brain is still functioning. As long as your brain is still functioning, still processing, you still have a voice. It still exists. And, Jessica, you brought up esophageal cancer. Well, I'm going to tell you a short little story. Let's look at the handout. Let's go to the next page. Some of you might be familiar with Efraín Huerta. We have looked at his writing before. Efraín Huerta was a Mexican poet and journalist. He actually started his own newspaper, and he was always very critical of the government. He was also a leftist, which, if for anyone, honestly, that is interested in learning more about Latin American politics, there is a very big period of time where communism was really had a very strong place given the colonial history of all of Latin America. But Efraín Huerta was again a poet who was very vocal, very, very critical, both in his writing and in his performance of his poetry about the government. And as he got older, he developed cancer, where his cancer was treatable, but it left him without the ability to fully speak and perform the way that he used to. So, to Miss Lois's point, his brain still was very much thinking, very much still writing poetry. However, because he loved using his physical voice, he for himself developed a style of poetry that was very different from his earlier works. He developed a form of poetry that allowed him to breathe his words. That's why his later life poetry, the poetry that he wrote towards the end of his days, was much shorter, like this one. And this comes from a book called El Gran Cocodrilo. It's a poetry book that is illustrated by Dr. Alderete. Dr. Alderete is an Argentinian graphic designer and illustrator. So that's what the images are here. This little poem is called Planes in Spanish, and it says, Todos los hacen para un borroso futuro. Yo los hago para un siniestro pero clarísimo pasado. And in English, I translated it, plans. And I'm trying to read it as he would have read it. Everyone makes them for a blurry future. I make them for a sinister but very clear past. If you read Efraín Huerta's earlier work, you'll note that his work, his voice is essentially the same. Always very clear, always very critical, of different things. Always with a sense of humor, and generally speaking, his diction, his word choice is essentially the same. Here we have another one, and I particularly like this one because of the play on words here. This one's called Weimar. This one, if you were to read every line as if you were breathing it, this I think definitely illustrates what he did, the lengths that he took to be able to continue to perform his poetry, even though he no longer had the real full use of his voice. And it goes, Como dijo Don Pulfango, tengo dolor de muelas en el corazón. And in English, as Sir Wolfgang said, I have molar pain in my heart. What is the effect that we have by poetry that is so short and essentially breathed? What do you feel when you hear or when you read these poems? I see a hand raised from Roots. Was that from earlier or?
It was from earlier, but I would like to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just like the way that everybody can relate right to a molar pain. Like what else is there that's worse than that? Like your whole head throbs. And so I feel like to have that and to say that it's in your heart, that speaks to how heartbroken he is, or the feeling that he wants to state. So yeah, that's my comment on the poem.
Yeah, I think that one's one of the stronger ones for sure in that little book. Miss Michelle?
This definitely they both speak volumes. However, this one about Mr. Wolfgang said, I have molar pain in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
It means and it won't go away, and it's a throbbing, it's an ache, and until you see a dentist, you're stuck with that rot and decay and yuck. And if you don't take care of yourself in that way and let that rot forever, rot as long as you think it should, you're going to get sepsis or septicemia, and eventually that's the way of the blood being infected, and you'll die.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is the part of death if you don't take care of that too.
Mm-hmm.
And your heart will, because you're brokenhearted.
Yeah, thanks, Miss Michelle. Miss Lois?
I just want to say that it's so heavy, and it doesn't take a whole lot of words to make a point. And I think it was Mother Teresa, and they says all she ever said was, Lord, have mercy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that short little phrase is it speaks volumes depending on the context in which it's used, for sure. Miss Luce wrote in the chat, I enjoyed the sound of breath in these poems. That is a great, I think, way of illustrating ultimately his drive for continuing to write, and not only write, but write poetry that he could still perform given his physical limitations. Which I think is that much more profound when you really, when you know ultimately about his physical limitations at the time. Jessica?
Yeah, I think the way you read it, kind of like what Luz said too, I think it's interesting. Again, like speaking of, I don't know, symbolism is my word of the day, but you can almost picture him sending out the message like until your last breath, you know,
Mm-hmm.
speak until your last breath. You have a voice. Well, we talked about with, I guess, with the other one where they
Mhm.
sewed their mouth closed, like you have a voice until your last breath. I mean, I think that's like a technique. It's an irony more than it was intentional,
Mhm.
but the imagery behind it, I guess knowing that story is getting me motivated to think of something like, if it were my last breath, what would I write?
Mhm. Well, guess what your homework assignment is for this week?
Better not do that. Just kidding.
It's actually that though. Like I want you to sort of put yourself in a situation where your final breath is going to be your final poem. So, knowing that and then knowing the five elements of style of voice, right? Your diction, your word choice, the imagery that you decide to use, the details that you decide to give us, your syntax, the length of your lines, and then of course your tone. Those five things are going to be the things that are going to shine the most in your final poem. So what I'd like you to do, and you can begin thinking about that now, begin processing it now, but really think about that for this week's homework assignment. Using your last breath. Imagine you're using your final breath of life. What is the poem that you would write? What is the poem that you would recite?
So, Luis,
Mhm.
like for example, this one here from Efraín Huerta.
Mhm.
Can you kind of like highlight a little bit, just to give us a little bit in terms of the what is that, the meanings, like the five voices, with just what he did right here.
Mhm.
Can you kind of help us with that?
Sure. So looking right here, I mean, it's sort of difficult, I want to say, to maybe look at the first one, which is diction. But I can tell you, at least from having read a lot of his work before, uh, his style was always kind of like this tongue-in-cheek, kind of everything is sort of written like a punchline. So that is reflected here, especially in this one, planes. Todos los hacen para un borroso futuro, right? Plans. Everyone makes them for a blurry future. I make them for a sinister but very clear past. So he makes plans because of he's like this sort of tongue in cheek, like I was a bad person in the past. So I'm making plans to remedy that, or plans to cover that, or whatever that plan might be. But his plans are informed by his sinister and clear past. So that's a very like tongue in cheek way of critiquing the concept of planning. You know, and again, he was always very critical of things of mostly politics and politicians, but diction wise, if we're going to look at the five elements of voice, that would be one of the things that you could point to and say, yeah, that's Efraín Huerta. Like that's a poem that he wrote for sure. And then looking at the syntax, right, the very deliberate length of each line, his syntax at this point in life was really dictated by his ability to breathe and ability to speak, because of the surgeries and the treatment for his cancer. So that's why his lines are either one or two words at the most, or three in the case of Yo los hago. So very extremely short little lines. And the fact that he decided to do the line breaks the way that he did is, I think, also a very specific way in which he is focusing on details. Um, to open this particular poem with the word todos, everyone. It's like a blanket statement, everyone. That attention to that detail is what makes this poem kind of that much stronger in its punchline. And there's a lot of different other little elements here that you can see of that kind of attention to detail. Borroso futuro, pero clarísimo pasado. So contrasts. Tone. I think the tone here, if we're going to look at that, it would probably be one of, again, kind of like a tongue-in-cheek sort of, critiquing, but in a funny sort of way to make it almost a joke. Plans themselves are kind of a joke, at least according to Efraín Huerta. And yeah, does that kind of help, Dr. Rosie?
Yes, it does very much. Thank you.
Okay. Jessica, you're on.
Thank you. Yeah, so this could be just like a mom thing, but obviously so we're talking like last breath, like if I were to die today, like I would probably, my only writing would probably be to my 2 boys. So would a letter to them count? Or I guess, or am I supposed to be thinking this like as if they're already well off into the world, and not that I would never have anything to worry about, but I'm in a different place in my life? Or it's hard for me to think that, to be honest with you, like my last breath, and my kids are so, you know what I'm saying? Like not think about, I mean, honestly, they would be the only people I'd really care to, not even my dad or my brothers or sisters, but.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it helps, maybe not necessarily like your dying breath, but those precious few breaths.
Because that's the other way where I'm going. I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah,
This is gonna be, I'm not trying to be an emotional wreck on this in this class.
Right.
Yeah,
that yeah, but think of it in the sense of like, your ability to speak, to physically speak, is no longer the same as it once was, right?
Okay, that helps.
So that's
That
kind of
helps.
the idea here.
Okay.
Taking maybe inspiration from the condition that Efraín Huerta found himself in, or in the condition of the vanquished before they're decapitated and their heads are shrunken. What are the final things that will live on, that are their voice, right? So think of it in that sense. Like these are your final breaths. That when your physical ability is starting to be limited.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah. So how will your voice live on? So any other questions? Is the homework assignment clear? Miss Michelle?
My question is, are we going to write it short like that? Short?
Yeah, if you want to
That's
do it relatively short, that'll obviously be as closely aligned to the concept of these are your final breaths.
Okay.
But if it goes a little bit longer than even an Efraín Huerta, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, really think about it though. Like this is kind of like really synthesizing all of the 5 elements of voice that you are able to recognize of your own voice. So like this is you, but like your voice, but like a hyper concentrated version of your voice.
Like Abraham. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And thank you for sharing that quote, Dr. Rosie.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So if there are no more questions, then we'll leave it at that for tonight. This video will be posted to YouTube, and along with the homework prompt, probably tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. And thank you, everyone. Have a great night. We'll be hopefully reading your final breath poems over the weekend. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Luis.
I thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was a great class.